calm waitress, a desperate robber, and a billionaire with a hidden agenda. When a robbery erupts in the heart of a quiet restaurant, everything changes in an instant. As fear spreads, one woman's unshakable calm becomes the key to saving everyone. But when a powerful figure steps in, will he control the chaos, or will the situation spiral out of control? This is more than just a robbery, it's a test of strength, humanity, and choices that could change everything. The sun was starting to set over the busy city, casting a warm golden glow through the windows of the cozy restaurant. The hum of conversation filled the air, with the clinking of glasses and the sizzling of food being prepared in the kitchen. It was a typical evening, the kind where everyone seemed to be going about their business without a care in the world. The restaurant was bustling with people, but there was one person who stood out from the crowd. The waitress. Her name was Emily, and she had worked at this restaurant for several years. She was a tall, graceful woman, always moving with purpose and poise, her dark brown hair tied neatly in a bun. There was something calming about her presence, as if she could handle any situation that came her way. It wasn't just the way she moved, but the way she spoke to the customers, always with a warm smile, a kind word, and a genuine interest in their well-being. On this particular evening, Emily was working the late shift. The restaurant was busy, but she was used to it. As she moved between tables, taking orders and delivering food, she seemed completely at ease, even in the midst of the hustle and bustle. To her, it was just another evening of doing what she did best, serving people with care and attention. But little did she know, this would be a night that would change everything. Across the room, a man sat alone at a corner table. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his sharp features highlighted by the soft lighting of the restaurant. His eyes were focused on the menu in front of him, but his mind seemed far away. This was John Mitchell, a billionaire businessman known for his vast empire and calm demeanor under pressure. He was in town for a business meeting, but tonight he decided to enjoy a quiet dinner alone. He wasn't the kind of man who sought attention or fame. He preferred to stay under the radar, enjoying life's simpler pleasures. John had been watching Emily for a few minutes now. There was something about her that intrigued him. While most people would be flustered by the chaos of a busy restaurant, she seemed to thrive in it. Her calm energy was contagious, and it made him wonder about the strength of character that allowed her to remain so composed in such a fast-paced environment. He noticed how she handled difficult customers with grace, how she moved through the room like she was in perfect control of the situation. It was rare to see someone so at ease with themselves and the world around them. But just as John was about to take another sip of his wine, the peaceful atmosphere was shattered. The door to the restaurant suddenly burst open with a loud bang, and a man wearing a mask stormed inside. In his hand, he gripped a large handgun, waving it frantically as he shouted at the patrons to remain seated and quiet. The noise of the robbery echoed through the room, sending a wave of panic across the diners, everyone down on the floor. Now, the robber screamed, his voice muffled by the mask. "This is a robbery. I want all the cash, now." Chaos erupted. In an instant, people screamed, some ducking under tables, others trying to hide in the corners of the restaurant. Waiters and waitresses froze in shock, unsure of what to do. The robber moved quickly, his eyes scanning the room as he barked orders at the staff and customers. But through all the noise and confusion, Emily remained perfectly still. She didn't panic. She didn't scream or run. Instead, she took a deep breath and calmly turned her attention toward the robber, her body language remaining composed and confident. It was as if she had entered another world, one where she was in control of her own emotions, no matter what was happening around her. John Mitchell, still seated at his table, couldn't help but notice Emily's calm demeanor. While the other diners were frantically trying to escape or shield themselves, she simply stood there, her posture unchanged. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet strength. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down. It was almost as if time had stopped, and John was caught in the stillness of the moment. The robber, sensing that something wasn't quite right, turned his attention to Emily. He pointed the gun at her and shouted, "Get down, now." But Emily didn't move. She looked the robber in the eye, her expression steady. "You don't need to do this," she said in a calm, clear voice. "No one here wants trouble." For a brief second, the robber seemed taken aback. He wasn't used to people speaking to him so calmly, especially in the midst of a robbery. His hand wavered slightly, and Emily seized the moment to keep her cool, as the robber barked more orders, demanding cash and valuables from the frightened customers. Emily remained calm, moving slowly toward the cash register. She knew she had to act, but she also knew that panicking wouldn't help anyone. Instead, she focused on staying composed and in control, her thoughts clear despite the chaos. From his seat, John watched her intently. He had seen many people in his life, but there was something about Emily's presence that stood out. She wasn't just a waitress, she was someone who could handle pressure, someone with an unshakable core. And in that moment, John Mitchell made a decision. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit there and watch. The sound of the robber's shouting echoed in the once peaceful restaurant, his words sharp and demanding. Everyone on the floor, now. His eyes scanned the room as if looking for someone who might try to resist. His voice trembled slightly, with tension, but it wasn't fear. It was an aggressive kind of panic or desperation that many robbers exhibit when they feel they've lost control. The atmosphere had shifted from casual to chaotic in an instant. Diners scrambled to the floor, ducking under tables, and some were crying, others were shaking. The staff stood frozen, some afraid to move, others unsure of what to do. The sight of the masked man with the gun was enough to send anyone into a state of fear. Yet, amidst the panic, Emily remained rooted in place, almost like a statue in the middle of the storm. She could feel the intensity of the moment, but her mind was clear. She was aware of the danger. She wasn't naive, but fear had no place in her mind right now. Instead, she took a slow, deep breath. Her years of experience of dealing with people under stress had trained her to stay calm in moments like these. This was no different. The robber's eyes flicked to Emily, and for the first time, he seemed to register her stillness. It was unnerving. Every other person in the room had either frozen or bolted, but here she stood, unwavering. In his mind, this wasn't supposed to happen. Fear was supposed to take over. It always did, but this woman, this calmness, it made him uneasy. He pointed the gun at her and barked, "Get down on the floor now. Do you hear me?" Emily didn't flinch. She looked straight into his eyes, her face calm but serious. "There's no need for violence," she said, her voice firm but steady. "Let's talk. You don't have to hurt anyone." For a moment, the robber hesitated. He wasn't used to being talked to like that. The majority of people in his line of work as victims tended to cower in fear, pleading with him. But this woman, this waitress, wasn't pleading. She wasn't afraid. It felt almost like he was the one being judged. He took a step toward her, his gun still raised, but something in her eyes stopped him in his tracks. She wasn't just standing still, she was holding her ground. It was the kind of strength that made him second-guess his actions. For the first time since he'd entered the restaurant, the robber faltered. Emily didn't back away, but instead took a step forward, her movements deliberate and controlled. She lowered her gaze briefly to the floor where the register was, calculating. It wasn't just the act of talking to him. She was figuring out the next move. How could she help defuse the situation? She wasn't sure, but she knew she had to try. Listen, you don't have to do this. There's a better way to handle this. I know it seems like there's no way out, but I promise there is. If you take a step back, there's a chance you won't end up making a mistake you'll regret. She said it slowly, clearly, but with no sense of urgency in her tone. The robber was still. His eyes narrowed, the gun still pointed at her, but he was listening now. This wasn't just a normal interaction. Emily could see the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't a hardened criminal. This wasn't something he had planned to do. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was fear. Behind Emily, John watched the exchange. With a keen eye, he had been quiet for most of the ordeal, but the moment he saw Emily stand her ground, he knew something was shifting. The way she carried herself, her quiet strength, it reminded him of moments in his own life where he had to make tough decisions. She was handling herself like a professional, as though she had been in situations like this before. But the question that lingered in his mind was, could she get through to the robber? Could she prevent this from escalating? As the robber's hand wavered, he started pacing in small circles, muttering to himself, eyes darting back and forth between the frightened customers and the calm waitress. You think you can stop me, he spat. You think anyone can stop me? Emily didn't move an inch, but she spoke again, her voice still as calm as ever. I'm not trying to stop you. I'm trying to help you see that there's another way out of this. You don't want to do this, not really. The consequences are going to be much bigger than you think. Her words seemed to penetrate his frantic thoughts, and the robber paused again. For the first time, there was a hint of doubt in his eyes. John, still observing, made a decision. He had watched the situation carefully, weighing his options. He could stand by and watch it all unfold, or he could take action. This wasn't a man who typically jumped into chaos. He had spent his life managing crises in the corporate world, making calm decisions under pressure. But this was different. The billionaire stood up from his seat, his chair scraping against the floor. The sound was enough to make the robber spin around, the gun swinging toward John. But instead of backing down, John took a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the room, his voice calm yet firm. I think we've had enough of this, don't you? John said, his voice carrying across the room with an authority that even the robber couldn't ignore. Emily turned her head slightly toward him, a small but thankful glance. She hadn't been sure if anyone else would step in, but now that he was, she knew it was time to keep the robber focused on something other than his own panic. The robber's hands shook slightly as he aimed the gun at John. But there was something in the billionaire's voice, something steady and confident, made the robber hesitate again. Put the gun down, John said, his voice low but unmistakable. This doesn't have to end in violence. The tension in the room hung thick in the air. The robber's eyes flickered between John and Emily, unsure of what to do next. His confidence was crumbling, piece by piece. And as he lowered his weapon, the room seemed to exhale collectively, as if the threat was finally beginning to dissipate. The room was still charged with tension, yet something had shifted. The robber, his gun now lowered and his posture slackened, seemed to realize the gravity of his actions. He wasn't running, and he wasn't pulling the trigger. The situation was changing, slowly but undoubtedly. John Mitchell watched the scene unfold with a steady gaze, his mind processing everything. The robber, now retreating, was no longer the threat he had been moments ago. Instead, the focus was on the woman at the center of the storm, the waitress, who had stood unshaken throughout the chaos. John wasn't an easily impressed man. He had seen enough in his life to know what it took to handle pressure, but what Emily had displayed was something different. It wasn't just calmness, it was a kind of inner strength, something that John himself had always sought in others. He'd been observing her closely throughout the ordeal, and the more he watched, the more fascinated he became. There was something about her composure that drew him in, something that made her seem far beyond her years. She wasn't acting. She was genuinely at peace with the chaos around her, a stark contrast to the fear and panic that had consumed the others in the room. But it wasn't just her calmness that intrigued him. It was the way she moved, the subtle way she navigated. The tension in the room. When the robber had demanded everyone stay on the floor, Emily had stayed still, not out of fear, but out of an unwavering belief that nothing would shake her. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't stubbornness. It was confidence and unspoken, powerful sense of self-control. John himself had dealt with crises, countless business meetings, and high-pressure decisions. In his world, everything was calculated, analyzed, and dissected. But this situation was different. This wasn't a corporate deal. This wasn't a negotiation in a boardroom. This was life or death, and Emily had handled it like it was just another day on the job. The more he observed, the more John felt an undeniable pull toward her strength. In a world where people often crumbled under the weight of pressure, Emily stood as a beacon of resolve. It reminded him of the way he had been raised, how his family had taught him the importance of keeping a level head no matter what life threw at you. But even so, he had never encountered someone quite like her. As the robber retreated to the back of the restaurant, leaving behind the bewildered patrons, Emily slowly exhaled. Her eyes, which had been unwavering through the entire ordeal, softened. For the first time since the chaos began, she glanced briefly at John, a quiet acknowledgement of his intervention. But it was more than just gratitude. There was a subtle recognition in her eyes, as if she too sensed the connection between them. Even though they hadn't spoken a word directly, John felt an odd sense of respect for her. The way she carried herself in that moment was not something he saw often, especially in the high-stress environment of the business world. Most people, especially in a situation as volatile as this, would have faltered. But Emily had not only kept herself composed, she had also helped diffuse the tension in the room just by being who she was. And John couldn't help but think, what kind of life had she lived to develop such poise? He was curious now, more than curious, in fact. He needed to know what made Emily tick, what had shaped her into the woman standing so confidently in front of him. And as the moments passed, and the room began to calm down, he found himself deep in thought. The restaurant, once chaotic, began to regain some semblance of normalcy. People started to sit up, their eyes still wide with shock. The sound of the robber's retreating footsteps echoed as he disappeared out the back door, leaving a trail of uncertainty in his wake. The police would arrive soon, but for now, the immediate danger had passed. Emily, however, remained focused. She turned her attention back to the patrons, offering them reassurance with a simple nod or a gentle smile. Her calmness seemed to ripple through the room, and slowly, people began to relax. John watched her, the flicker of admiration in his eyes growing stronger. He had a sense of how rare it was to come across someone like Emily. The way she had handled herself without hesitation, without fear, was extraordinary. And in that moment, he realized that he hadn't just witnessed a waitress deal with a robbery. He had witnessed someone with a rare form of grace under pressure, the kind of grace that often went unnoticed in the chaos of life. As he sat there, contemplating the events that had unfolded, John's thoughts wandered back to his own life. His empire, his wealth, his influence, none of it had ever been enough to give him this kind of peace. He had everything most people could ever dream of, but when it came to inner peace, he was still searching. Emily, however, seemed to possess something he had never found, an unshakable calm, an inner tranquility that allowed her to handle whatever came her way. It made him wonder, what would it take for him to find that kind of peace? And as the moments passed, John began to realize that he wasn't just admiring Emily for her ability to handle a crisis. He was admiring her for something deeper, that kind of strength that went beyond external circumstances. It was a strength of character, something that came from within. As the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm, with people picking up their conversations and the wait staff resuming their duties, John remained in his seat, watching Emily. He couldn't help but feel drawn to her in a way he hadn't felt in years. Her calmness had sparked something in him, something he wasn't sure he fully understood yet. But one thing was clear. John Mitchell had just witnessed something extraordinary, and he wasn't going to forget it anytime soon. The events of the last few minutes had left the restaurant in a state of stunned silence, but the air was still thick with tension. The robber's retreat had provided a brief moment of relief, but the unease lingered like a heavy fog, and for a split second it seemed as though the calm was only temporary. Emily stood still for a moment, ensuring that everyone around her was all right. She scanned the room, meeting the eyes of a few patrons who still looked bewildered. Her presence was a reassuring constant, but even she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that seemed to hang over the restaurant. John had also remained seated, his thoughts swirling as he processed everything that had happened. The robber's exit had been unexpected, and for a moment John had thought it was all over. But now something felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that the situation wasn't as resolved as it seemed. The robber had left, but the tension in the room was palpable. And then, suddenly, there was a shift. The quiet that had followed the robber's exit was shattered by the unmistakable sound of a door slamming open again. The back door to the restaurant creaked, and in an instant, the figure of the robber reappeared, his face still hidden behind the mask. His eyes were frantic, his breathing heavy. He wasn't done. "Get back on the ground," the robber screamed, his voice now more desperate than before. "Everyone, get down. I'll shoot anyone who tries to move." The room, which had started to regain some semblance of normalcy, erupted once again into chaos. But this time, there was an added layer of fear. The robber wasn't just demanding money or valuables anymore. He was increasingly unhinged, and his desperation was clear. His hand shook as it gripped the gun, and his wild eyes scanned the room, looking for someone to break the silence. People dove back to the floor, scrambling to protect themselves, some hiding beneath tables, others ducking behind chairs. Emily's calm demeanor had been enough to diffuse the immediate danger before, but this time was different. The robber's unpredictability had escalated the situation. John's heart raced in his chest. This wasn't the same robbery anymore. There was no more logic in it, no more rules. This man wasn't just looking for money, he was looking for control, for something to grasp onto in the chaos of his own life. John could see it in the way his hands trembled, the way his eyes darted. Around the room, desperate and unsure. Emily, however, didn't flinch. Her composure never wavered, even as the robber raised his gun again, this time more agitated. She stood her ground, her gaze meeting his without hesitation. "Please," she said, her voice just as calm as it had been before. "You don't need to do this." But the robber was beyond reason now. His eyes flashed with panic, and his gun trembled as if it were an extension of his fear. The room fell into a hushed silence once again, but the tension was unbearable. People held their breath, not knowing what would happen next. John's instincts kicked in, and without thinking, he stood up again, his movements controlled. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face was calm, almost unnervingly so. He wasn't going to stand by again, not when things were escalating. This wasn't a matter of just watching anymore. It was a matter of acting, of using everything at his disposal to protect these people. He slowly made his way toward the robber, taking deliberate steps. The robber's eyes flicked toward him, then back to Emily, but he didn't pull the trigger. John's voice rang out, low and steady. "Put the gun down. There's no reason for this to go any further." The robber's breath was ragged now, and his face twisted with confusion. "Stay away from me," he shouted, his voice cracking. I'll shoot anyone who moves." But John didn't stop. He continued to approach, not with aggression, but with calm authority. The room seemed to hold its breath as he moved closer to the man who had terrorized them all. Emily didn't move, but her eyes flicked toward John, a silent understanding passing between them. John stopped a few feet away from the robber, keeping his voice even and firm. "This isn't you. You're not a killer. You don't want to make this mistake." The robber's gun hand wavered, his body language showing signs of hesitation. His movements were erratic now, his breathing rapid, and his eyes were wide, searching for a way out of the chaos he had created. John's gaze softened, his voice steady. "You're not a monster. You don't have to do this. Just put the gun down. Let's talk." For a long moment, there was silence. The robber's chest heaved, his eyes flickering between John and the waitress, still standing calmly amidst the chaos. He was caught in a moment of indecision, trapped between fear and reason. It was clear that his mind was racing, but no matter how hard he tried to justify his actions, the weight of what he was about to do was beginning to dawn on him. John took another step forward, his presence commanding. He wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just a wealthy man. He was a man who had seen the worst of life, and somehow, in that moment, he felt more connected to this man than he ever thought possible. Desperation, fear, and confusion, they were all universal feelings. And he knew that if he didn't act now, the situation would spiral further out of control. "Put it down," John repeated, his voice calm but insistent. The robber's hand trembled even more as the gun lowered, slowly, inch by inch. It was as though the act of lowering the weapon was an acknowledgement of the truth John had spoken. But even as the robber let go of his weapon, his fear didn't completely dissipate. He still stood there, shaking, his mind racing. And then, in that moment of suspended time, John made a decision. He stepped forward and placed a hand gently on the robber's shoulder. The gesture was one of authority, but also of empathy. Invitation to trust, to leave the chaos behind and find a different path. As the robber's shaking hand finally lowered the weapon, the the silence in the room deepened. The threat that had loomed over everyone just moments ago seemed to melt away, replaced by a heavy stillness. People slowly began to sit up, cautiously, glancing around as though testing whether it was safe to breathe again. But despite the outward calm that was settling over the room, there was still a deep tension, a sense that this was not yet over, that it wasn't just the robber's actions that had made this moment so heavy, but something deeper. Emily stood, her body still as composed as ever, watching as John moved toward the robber. Her eyes were sharp, her mind focused entirely on the situation unfolding before her. Her calmness had been the first to diffuse the initial shock of the robbery. But it was clear now that the gravity of the situation was beginning to sink in. The man who had come in with a gun was standing before her, the weapon now lowered, but his fear was still palpable. She had always been good at reading people, something she had learned quickly in her years as a waitress, where every person that walked through the door brought with them their own stories, their own fears, and their own desires. Emily had learned to observe, to sense the unspoken emotions beneath the surface. And right now, as she looked at the robber, she could see it, the fear, the regret, the confusion in that moment. As John's voice had calmed the robber, Emily realized something important. It wasn't just about staying calm for her own sake or the sake of the customers in the room. It was about recognizing that this man wasn't truly a villain. He was a person, too, someone who had made a poor decision, someone who was now facing the consequences of his actions. And somehow, without even meaning to, he had shown her that even in the darkest of moments, there was still humanity to be found. She turned her attention away from the robber and looked at John. He was standing there, with his hand gently resting on the robber's shoulder, trying to guide him out of his panic. Emily had noticed how he had stepped into the situation without hesitation, without fear, and without the arrogance that many people in his position might have carried. There was something grounded in him, something real. But it wasn't just his actions that intrigued her. It was the way he had responded to her calmness, when John had first noticed her standing steady amid the chaos. She had assumed he was just another person who had been impressed by her composure. But now, after observing him, she realized there was more to him. He had recognized something in her that most people didn't see. He had seen the strength that wasn't immediately obvious, the kind of strength that was born of experience and perseverance rather than bravado or aggression. Emily's mind wandered back to her past. Growing up wasn't easy, nothing was ever handed to her. She had learned early on that life wasn't about avoiding hardships. It was about learning to face them head-on, to stand tall even when everything around you was crumbling. She had faced difficult situations as a child, witnessed the pain of her parents' struggles, and learned to navigate through uncertainty. Those experiences had shaped her. And though she had spent many years burying the pain of those times, it had given her an unshakable core. It had taught her the true meaning of strength. But even more than that, Emily had learned that true strength wasn't about physical power or brute force. It was about inner peace. It was about being able to find stillness in the storm. And that was the key to her calmness. It wasn't just a reaction to the situation, it was who she had become over the years. She was unafraid of chaos because she had learned to control the only thing she could control, herself. As the moments passed and the robber remained still, his body shaking but the gun now lowered, Emily's thoughts returned to the present. The robber was standing there in front of John, but she knew that he was just as lost as anyone else. It wasn't just the situation that had caused him to act, it was the fear, the frustration, the feeling that there was no way out. But now, In the calm aftermath of his initial outburst, Emily could see that his resolve was crumbling. John's presence, his calm yet authoritative voice, had helped guide him back from the edge. But Emily knew that it wasn't just John's words that were making a difference. It was the entire atmosphere, the fact that they weren't treating this man as a criminal, but as a person who had made a mistake. She stepped forward, her footsteps light but determined. The room was still quiet, the tension hanging in the air. But Emily knew this was the moment she had to act, to say something that would help finish what had started. The robber was still standing, his face masked with fear and regret. But she knew he needed one final push. "Listen," Emily said, her voice gentle but firm. "It's okay. It's over now. You can leave this behind." The robber's eyes flickered toward her. It wasn't the defiant look of someone ready to fight, it was the look of someone who was starting to realize the weight of their choices. His gun lowered further, and his shoulders slumped in exhaustion. The fight in him seemed to drain, replaced by the overwhelming realization that there was no way out of this through violence. John stepped back, giving Emily the space she needed to continue. The atmosphere in the restaurant had changed once again. It was no longer one of fear and panic, it was one of quiet reflection. Emily was showing this man, through her words and actions, that there was always another way. There was always a path forward that didn't involve destruction. The robber looked around the room, his gaze softening as he saw the people who had once been cowering now looking at him not with fear, but with something else, perhaps understanding, perhaps even empathy. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had made a mistake, and in that moment he seemed to recognize it. "Go home," Emily said softly, her tone unwavering. "It's not too late." With that, the robber dropped the gun entirely. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply turned and walked toward the door. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on anyone in the room. There would be no police chase, no further escalation. The robber, once a threat, had chosen the better path. Emily stood there, still composed, but there was a slight release of tension in her shoulders. She had done what she could. She had done her part to bring peace in the face of chaos. It wasn't the end of her story or of anyone else's, but it was a reminder that even in the most dangerous of situations, inner strength and calm could change the outcome. As the last echo of the door slamming behind the robber faded, the restaurant was left in a tense silence, as though time itself had taken a pause. The customers, still crouched under tables or half standing in cautious poses, slowly began to emerge from their hiding places. The initial fear had faded, but it was replaced by a collective breath of disbelief. They had just lived through a robbery, one that seemed impossible to survive without casualties. But, miraculously, they had made it through. Emily stood still, her posture relaxed but alert, her mind racing in quiet contemplation. As she slowly surveyed the room, she saw the relieved expressions of the patrons and heard the hushed murmurs of gratitude. The moment felt surreal to her, almost as though she were witnessing the entire situation from an outside perspective. It was hard to believe that only minutes ago, chaos had engulfed the room, and now it was slowly returning to normal. But even with the robber gone and the immediate danger past, Emily knew that the storm hadn't completely passed. There were still ripples from the event, emotional and psychological ones, that would need time to settle. As the sounds of the restaurant began to return to their usual rhythm, the clinking of glasses, the murmurs of conversation, Emily couldn't help but turn her gaze to the man who had made a significant difference in this situation. John Mitchell, John, was still standing, his posture strong. Yet there was a calmness in his demeanor that contrasted the chaos of the last few minutes. He wasn't just a businessman who had watched from a corner. He had stepped up when it mattered most. He had stood between the chaos and the calm, acting decisively to keep the situation from escalating. Emily had noticed him from the start. But it wasn't until the moment he stood up and walked toward the robber that she had truly understood what kind of man he was. He wasn't just a spectator. He wasn't just someone who had acted because he could. No, John Mitchell was a man who had seen an opportunity to make a difference, and he had taken it. The way he had moved toward the robber was not out of bravado or a desire to prove something. It was out of a sense of responsibility. His voice had been firm but calm, his words clear and controlled. He didn't act like a man of wealth or privilege. He acted like someone who had seen fear in people's eyes before, someone who knew how to speak to others in a way that made them listen, without aggression or coercion. It was a subtle strength that Emily had noticed in him, one that didn't demand attention but commanded respect. For a moment, Emily caught John's eye. It was a brief glance, but it was enough. The unspoken understanding between them was palpable. There had been no need for grand gestures, no speeches, no confrontation. John had simply taken action when the moment called for it, and in doing so, he had proved something to both Emily and himself, something that would resonate long after the robber had fled. John took a slow, deliberate step back, letting his gaze sweep across the room. He could feel the weight of the moment settling in. This wasn't just about averting a crisis. It was about the responsibility that came with the decision to act. As a businessman, John was accustomed to high-stakes decisions, but nothing had ever felt quite as personal as this. What had drawn him into the situation wasn't just the danger. It wasn't the thrill of stepping in. It was the quiet strength that Emily had displayed. He had recognized something in her calmness, a quality that he admired. But more than that, it was the sense of humanity that lingered in the air, a realization that there was always more to a person than their actions. He had seen that in the robber's eyes. When the gun had been lowered, it wasn't fear that had caused the man to stop, but something deeper, a fleeting moment of doubt perhaps, or a realization that he didn't want to be remembered for his worst decision. And when that moment had come, John had been there, offering the kind of quiet intervention that allowed the robber to back down. But now, as the room settled into its new normal, John found himself wondering how the event had affected Emily. She had been the one to first de-escalate the situation. She had been the one who had stood firm when the robber had demanded the most. But what had gone through her mind in those critical moments? John couldn't help but admire her. She had not only shown strength in the face of danger, but also demonstrated something else: empathy. In the middle of a robbery, when everyone else was worried about their own safety, she had thought about the robber as a person. She had tried to reason with him, to talk to him as if he was someone worth saving. He realized that he was curious about her, about who she was beyond the waitress, who had calmed the entire room. What had shaped her into the person who could stand so unwaveringly in the face of danger? He took another step forward, now closing the distance between them. Emily, sensing his approach, turned her gaze toward him. Her eyes were steady, as they had been through the entire ordeal. But this time, there was a softness to her gaze, a quiet acknowledgement of what had just transpired. "You handled that, ... remarkably well," John said, his voice low but filled with genuine respect. "I don't think I could have stayed that calm in your shoes." Emily nodded slightly, offering a modest smile. I've had my share of tough situations. You learn to manage yourself." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. John could see that she wasn't just speaking about the robbery. She was speaking about life itself, at the struggles and challenges she had faced and overcome. And somehow that made him want to know more. What kind of life had she lived to develop that level of composure? Emily's eyes flickered toward the door, as if expecting the robber to return at any moment. But then she seemed to relax, a quiet exhale escaping her lips. "I've had my fair share of difficult situations. It's the only way to learn how to stay steady." John nodded. He understood now. Her strength was not born from some singular moment of heroism. It was a product of her experiences, of everything she had faced and overcome in her life. She had learned how to be steady, how to keep her calm no matter what. And that was a lesson he was beginning to learn himself. There was a brief silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared moment of understanding. John had seen her strength, and now he saw her for who she truly was, not just a waitress, but someone who had mastered the art of inner peace. "Thank you," he said softly. "For everything." Emily's smile deepened, and for a moment the world outside the restaurant seemed to fade away. It wasn't about the robbery anymore. It was about something much deeper, the realization that sometimes the most unexpected people possess the most profound strength. The restaurant had finally settled into a quiet lull, the kind of calm that follows a storm. The sounds of clinking silverware, soft murmurs of conversation, and the occasional cough filled the space. But the atmosphere was entirely different from what it had been only moments before. The immediate threat was gone, but the weight of what had happened lingered. An unspoken reminder that everything had nearly spiraled into something far worse. As Emily continued to stand, her stance relaxed, yet still alert, she couldn't help but feel the adrenaline slowly ebbing from her body. She had dealt with difficult customers before, dealt with confrontations, and seen her fair share of chaos in the restaurant business. But this, this was different. The danger had been real, and the fear that had gripped the room was palpable. And yet, she had held firm. It wasn't just because of training or experience, it was something deeper. Something that had been built over years of handling life's many challenges. But now, as she glanced around at the other patrons who were beginning to return to their meals, the full weight of the moment began to hit her. She wasn't just a waitress in a restaurant. In that moment, she had been the anchor for an entire room of people. And that was something she'd never truly considered before. But more than that, Emily realized that the situation wasn't as simple as it seemed. Yes, the robber had left, but the psychological toll of the event would ripple through the room for much longer than the physical threat. John, standing beside her now, seemed to be in much the same place. He had stepped in when the robber's threat had escalated, when it seemed like there was no more room for reason. And in doing so, he had done more than just save the day. He had restored a sense of calm to the chaos that had nearly consumed the room. But John too was still processing. The calm on the surface didn't mean the battle within had ended. As he turned toward Emily, their eyes met again. She had been the one to stop the situation from escalating initially, but he had been the one to step in when the robbery had intensified. It was clear now both of them had played a role, but it wasn't just about the actions they had taken. It was about the mindset they had shared, the ability to remain composed, to handle the unexpected without falling into the panic that most people would have succumbed to. But Emily knew that the events of the last few minutes had been driven by far more than the robber's mere desire for money. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. This was a man who had come into the restaurant not just to take, but to take control. She had recognized it in his eyes the moment he had raised the gun. Fear, frustration, and desperation had driven him to that point. It wasn't just the money that he wanted, it was the power to impose his will on the room. The robber had been operating from a place of complete loss, and it had been that loss of control that had made him dangerous. Emily turned back toward John, her voice soft but steady. It wasn't just about the money, you know. John looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly in thought. What do you mean? He wasn't just trying to rob us, Emily explained, her gaze distant, as though she were piecing together the events in her mind. He was trying to control the situation. It wasn't enough to just take the cash. He wanted to impose fear, to make everyone bend to his will. It was about power, not just money. John paused for a moment, taking in her words. He had considered many aspects of the event, but Emily's insight made him think of the situation in a completely different light. The robber's behavior had been erratic and driven by a fear that transcended the typical motives of a criminal. He had been searching for control in a world where it seemed like everything was slipping away from him. I see, John replied quietly. He didn't just want the cash. He wanted to feel like he was in control. Emily nodded, and that's why he got so agitated when things didn't go according to plan. When we didn't react the way he thought we would, it threw him off. He couldn't process it. John's eyes lingered on her for a moment, and he realized that she had seen something in the robber that he had missed in the initial chaos. It was the calmness in the storm that had allowed her to recognize the deeper layers of the situation, the underlying motivations that drove the man to behave the way he did. For a brief moment, they both stood there, surrounded by the quiet hum of the restaurant. The tension hadn't completely disappeared, but it had been transformed. There was still work to be done, but the immediate danger had passed. People were still recovering from the shock, but the worst was over. But as John stood there, something else occurred to him. This moment wasn't just about the robber. It was about the choices they had all made in the face of adversity. Emily had chosen to stand firm when others would have panicked. She had chosen calmness when chaos surrounded her. And John, too, had made his choice to step in when the situation demanded it, to lead with authority when the time called for it. He turned to Emily, a new level of respect in his eyes. You were right. He wasn't looking for money. He was looking for control. Emily offered him a small, almost imperceptible smile. It's easy to miss in the middle of the chaos. But that's the difference between surviving and letting fear take over. It's all about control, not just of the situation, but of yourself. John took in her words. It was clear to him now that Emily wasn't just a waitress. She was someone who had mastered the art of staying composed when everything else was falling apart. And in doing so, she had helped them all stay safe. She had helped John, too. He had acted because she had shown him what it meant to remain grounded in the storm. And as the room slowly began to return to its normal rhythm, with people standing up and chatting softly, John knew one thing for certain. This night had changed. He had been witness to something far more than just a robbery, had been a lesson in the power of staying calm under pressure, in the strength of inner peace. Thank you, John said, his voice sincere. For everything, Emily simply nodded, but her eyes held something more, something deep and unspoken. She had done her part, but the lesson, she knew, wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had been in that room, and for herself. Too, it was a reminder that no matter what happened, The one thing that could never be taken away was the power to choose how to respond. The once panic-stricken atmosphere in the restaurant slowly began to settle. The moment the robber had walked out of the door, leaving behind his gun and the destruction he'd intended to cause, the room was filled with quiet relief. But even as the immediate threat dissipated, a sense of unease lingered, heavy in the air. People were still recovering from the shock, still catching their breath. The restaurant, which had been filled with the sounds of fear and confusion, now hummed with soft, cautious murmurs, but the weight of what had just transpired was not lost on anyone. The night was forever changed. It wasn't just about the robbery. Any more, it was about how it was handled. The decisions made in that very moment had determined the outcome, and the way people reacted had turned what could have been a tragedy into a story of resilience. And calm in the face of chaos, Emily stood at the edge of the room, her gaze fixed on the door the robber had left through. Her body was no longer as tense as it had been moments ago, but she knew that this calm wasn't just the result of the robber's departure. It was because of the choices that had been made. Her own decision to stand her ground, John's intervention, and the way the entire restaurant had pulled together in the face of danger. Those were the real reasons the night had ended without more harm. They had acted as a collective force, no longer victims of fear, but empowered by their ability to choose their responses. John, standing a few feet away, was processing the same thoughts. He had acted quickly in the moment, but now, as the dust settled, he found himself reflecting on the events. The robber's retreat wasn't a moment of victory, it was a moment of surrender, one that had been brought about by the collective willpower of the room. The robber hadn't left because he had won. He had left because he had lost control, because the calmness of the situation had undermined the very thing that had driven him, fear. The silence in the restaurant deepened as people began to relax, but no one truly knew what to say. How do you speak after something like this? What words could capture the magnitude of what had just occurred? Emily broke the silence, her voice soft but steady, a quiet acknowledgement of the moment. "It's over now," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of the patrons who were beginning to rise from the floor. Her words didn't seem to carry the weight of finality that one might expect after a life-threatening situation. Instead, they felt like a declaration of peace, a closing chapter in a story that had unfolded in unexpected ways. The tension that had gripped the room had not been broken by loud words or dramatic actions. It had been dismantled by a simple, unyielding calmness. John nodded in agreement, his eyes scanning the room, his posture still unshaken. "Yes, it's over. But it's important that we don't forget what happened. The way we handled this matters." Emily turned to face him, her brow furrowing slightly as she processed his words. "What do you mean?" John's eyes met hers with a quiet intensity. "We didn't just survive this. We showed that when people come together, when they remain calm, they can handle even the most dangerous of situations. The way you stood your ground when everything else was falling apart, that made all the difference. Your calmness wasn't just an action, it was an anchor for everyone here." Emily was silent for a moment, taking in his words. She hadn't thought about it in those terms. To her, it had simply been a matter of doing what needed to be done, of staying composed, for the sake of the people around her. But now, hearing John's perspective, she realized that her actions had done more than just prevent the situation from escalating. They had allowed everyone else in the room to feel safe enough to do the same. "I just did what felt right," she said, her voice a bit quieter. "But maybe that's what made it work. I didn't let myself get swept up in the panic." John's lips curled into a small smile, one of admiration. Exactly. It's not easy to stay calm when everyone else is losing their mind. But you did it, and that made all the difference. Emily nodded, but before she could respond, the sound of police sirens outside the restaurant interrupted their conversation. The situation was now in the hands of the authorities, and the real-world consequences of the robbery would soon follow. The police would ask questions, file reports, and deal with the legal aspects. But for now, the immediate threat had ended, and for the people in the restaurant, that was enough. As the officers entered the restaurant, their presence served as a reminder that the situation wasn't over in the way most people would expect. There was still the practical side of things to deal with: the paperwork, the police reports, the need for everyone to recount what had happened. But even as they moved through the restaurant, questioning the staff and patrons, there was an undeniable sense of relief. No one had been hurt. No one had been seriously harmed. And that was because of the calmness, the quick thinking, and the collective effort of everyone who had been present. As the officers moved toward the back of the restaurant to examine the area where the robber had fled, Emily looked around the room one last time. The faces of the patrons were no longer twisted in fear. Instead, they wore expressions of gratitude, of quiet respect for what they had just experienced. They had been through something extraordinary together, something that would leave a mark. On all of them, John lingered for a moment, taking in the scene around him. He was still processing, still reflecting on the events of the night. He had been a businessman for so long, focused on numbers and deals and strategy, but tonight had shown him something far more profound. It wasn't just about wealth or power. It was about how people handled themselves in the face of danger, how they responded to the chaos around them. And as he glanced back at Emily, he knew one thing for certain: she had taught him a lesson. In strength he would never forget. The true measure of strength wasn't in the loud, dramatic gestures. It was in the quiet moments when one remained calm, when one could face danger without flinching. Emily had done that, and because of it, the night had ended without tragedy. The arrival of the police marked a turning point in the evening. The chaos of the robbery, though still fresh in everyone's mind, was beginning to settle into something more manageable. The situation was being handed over to the authorities, and the immediate danger was behind them. But there was still an undercurrent of unease in the air. It was as though the events of the past hour were still reverberating in the room, echoing in the minds of the people who had experienced them. Emily stood off to the side, her arms crossed in front of her as she observed the scene. She had been through enough in her life to know that moments like these were far more than just events. They were turning points. People would remember this night for years to come, not just because of what had happened, but because of how they had responded, how they had faced the storm and come out the other side unscathed. As the officers moved through the restaurant, questioning patrons and staff members, Emily could sense the growing sense of relief. The adrenaline that had been coursing through her veins just minutes ago was beginning to fade, replaced by the quiet exhaustion that often follows a crisis. It was a relief, yes, but it was also something more. It was the knowledge that the situation had been handled with calm and clarity, and that everyone in the room had contributed to that outcome in some way. The officers asked Emily to recount what had happened, and she did so with the same calmness that had guided her throughout the entire ordeal. There was no need to embellish the story, no need to make it more dramatic than it already was. She simply told them what had happened, from the moment the robber entered to the moment he left. She didn't focus on the fear she had felt, or the adrenaline that had surged through her. She focused on the facts, the sequence of events, and the role she had played in keeping everyone safe. John, standing nearby, was also questioned. He was a quiet presence in the room now, watching the officers with a calm demeanor that was almost reassuring. He didn't seek attention or recognition. He simply answered the questions asked of him, his voice steady, his responses measured. To the officers, he was just another witness, someone who had acted in the heat of the moment. But Emily knew that his role in this situation was far more than just that. He had been the one who had helped de-escalate the situation, who had stepped in when things were at their most critical. His actions had been as vital as hers in ensuring that the situation didn't spiral further out of control. As the questioning continued, the mood in the restaurant shifted. The patrons, who had once been wide-eyed with fear, were now speaking in quiet tones. They shared their own versions of what had happened, recounting their own experiences of the robbery. There were murmurs of gratitude, of appreciation for the calmness of Emily and John, and for the way they had handled the situation. Some even expressed their surprise at how everything had unfolded. They had expected chaos to ensue, but instead, there had been a strange sense of order in the midst of the chaos. It wasn't just Emily and John who had contributed to the outcome of the night. It was the way the entire room had responded, the way everyone had stayed as calm as possible, even in the face of danger. The way they had followed Emily's example, choosing not to panic but to remain steady and composed. It was a collective effort, and it had made all the difference. After the police had finished their questioning and assured everyone that the situation was under control, Emily was left standing near the door, her hands now resting at her sides. The tension in the room had lifted, and people were beginning to gather their things and prepared to leave. But as they did, they offered Emily and John small gestures of thanks and nod, a smile or a simple thank you for keeping them safe. Emily smiled softly to herself. It wasn't the kind of recognition she was used to, but it meant more to her than anything else. These were not the kinds of people who offered praise lightly. They had been through something together, and the quiet gratitude they expressed was a reflection of that shared experience. Emily hadn't needed to be a hero. She had simply needed to be herself, calm, steady, and in control. And that had been enough. John, who had been standing by the door, turned to her as the last of the patrons made their way out. His eyes met hers, and there was a moment of silent understanding between them. Neither of them had sought recognition for what they had done. They had acted because it was the right thing to do. But there was no denying that their actions had made a difference. "Thank you," John said quietly, his voice sincere. "For everything, you were incredible." Emily gave him a small smile, her eyes soft. "We all did our part," she replied. "It wasn't just me, it was all of us. We kept our heads, and we got through it." John nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he spoke again. "I don't think I could have stayed as calm as you did. You kept everyone grounded. You kept me grounded." Emily chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I don't know about that. I was just trying to make sure everyone stayed safe." John raised an eyebrow, a hint of admiration in his expression. "Well, you did more than that. You made sure everyone stayed human." There was a brief silence between them, and then Emily laughed quietly, the tension of the night finally lifting from her shoulders. "That's one way of putting it," she said with a smile. As they both stood there, the weight of the evening finally began to settle. The restaurant, once filled with the echoes of panic, was now quiet. The patrons had left, the police had finished their work, and the world outside was slowly returning to normal. But for Emily and John, the night had been a reminder of the power of calm, the importance of remaining composed even when everything seemed to be falling apart. They had both played a role in the outcome, but it wasn't about the credit. It was about what had been achieved in that single, fleeting moment when they had made the choice to act, to remain steady, and to stay human. The restaurant had finally returned to its natural rhythm, the last of the patrons leaving quietly, their footsteps fading into the background as they exited the doors into the cool night. The police had finished their investigations, and the scene that had once been so filled with tension was now quiet, almost peaceful. The lights in the restaurant still shone brightly, casting soft glows on the polished tables and chairs. The air, once heavy with fear, now felt lighter, though not without its weight. Emily stood behind the counter, tidying up. The events of the evening were still fresh in her mind, and as much as she had tried to move forward, there was a part of her that couldn't shake the feeling of what had just happened. She had been the one to remain calm when everyone else was losing their heads. But even now, as the adrenaline wore off, Emily felt something inside her that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just relief, it was a sense of purpose. As she wiped down the counter, her mind wandered back to the robber, to the strange look in his eyes when he had left. Emily had seen that look before: frustration, fear, the overwhelming need to control a situation when everything was falling apart. He hadn't been a villain, not really. He had been a person in pain, someone who had made a terrible decision out of desperation, and she had seen that before in her life. She had seen people do irrational things when they felt cornered, when they felt they had no way out. Emily's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up to see John walking toward her, his tall frame casting a long shadow under the soft restaurant lighting. His face was calm, but there was something in his eyes that seemed different, now something more reflective, more thoughtful than before. "Hey," he said softly, a small smile on his face. "I guess it's really over now." Emily returned his smile, a soft chuckle escaping her lips. "Yeah, I think it is. Looks like it's time to close up." John nodded, his gaze sweeping the restaurant. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about tonight," he said, his voice steady, "about what happened, ... and about you." Emily raised an eyebrow, not sure where he was going with this. "Oh, and what about me?" "You saved us all," he said, his tone serious now. "I'm not just talking about handling the robber. You saved us by staying calm. I've never seen someone handle a crisis like that." Emily shook her head, a slight smile on her face. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just did what I had to do." John's expression softened. "No, Emily, what you did was extraordinary. You did what needed to be done when it counted the most. Not everyone can do that. Not everyone can stay calm in the face of danger. You reminded me of something I've forgotten along the way." She tilted her head, curiosity piqued. "What's that?" "That sometimes the most important thing you can do is stay steady," he replied. "In business, in life, in anything. When things go wrong, people often panic. But you reminded me that there's always a choice to stay grounded, no matter what." Emily listened, her heart warming at his words. "I've been through a lot in my life, John. I guess I learned early on that there's always something you can control, even if everything else feels out of control. It's how you respond, and that's what I've tried to remember every day." John nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "I get that now, and I think I've learned something tonight. I've spent so much time chasing control in my business, in my life. But the truth is, the only thing you really have control over is yourself. The rest, well, that's just out of your hands. And when you realize that, you start to see things differently. There was a quiet moment between them, one filled with mutual understanding. Emily had always believed in the power of personal strength, of choosing calmness in the face of chaos. But hearing it from John, seeing how it had affected him, made her realize that this wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been there that night, everyone who had chosen to remain steady instead of giving in to panic. They had all learned something in that moment as they stood there. The soft sounds of the restaurant now filling the space, John took a step closer to the counter. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. You know, Emily, ... I'm not one to make impulsive decisions, but after everything tonight, I feel like I have to do something. I feel like I need to make a gesture, something that shows my gratitude. For what you did. Emily frowned slightly, not sure what he meant. You don't have to do anything, John. You've already done more than enough. John smiled, but there was something serious in his gaze. No, I've been thinking. What you did tonight wasn't just a service to the people in this restaurant. It was a service to me, too, and to everyone who's ever found themselves at a crossroads, unsure of how to act. You gave me a lesson in strength that I'll carry with me for a long time. He paused, his words hanging in the air for a moment. Then, as if making a decision, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. Emily looked at him, her brow furrowing in confusion as he placed it on the counter. Take it, John said quietly. It's an invitation to come work with me. Emily's eyes widened in surprise. What do you mean? I'm offering you a chance, he said. A chance to leave this behind and step into something bigger. I've seen what you can do in the face of adversity, and I know you could bring that same level of calm and strength to anything you set your mind to. I'm starting a new project, and I need someone like you, someone who can handle pressure and still think clearly. It's not just about business. It's about finding the strength to lead, to inspire, and to make a difference. For a moment, Emily didn't speak. The idea was overwhelming, unexpected. But as she looked at the card, she realized something. Deep within hers, something that had always been there, but had never fully come to the surface. She had the strength to take on challenges beyond the restaurant. She had the strength to change not just her own life, but to make a difference in the lives of others. Thank you, she said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. I'll think about it. John smiled, his eyes warm. Take your time. No pressure. But whatever you decide, know that tonight you showed me something I won't forget. As he walked out of the restaurant, Emily stood there for a long moment, staring at the card in her hand. The night had been full of surprises, but this was the biggest one of all. And as she looked around the quiet, empty restaurant, she realized that she had learned something too. She had learned that sometimes the best way forward is to stay steady, to trust yourself, and to know that even in the darkest of moments, you have the power to change the outcome.